Here we are on the last segment, the third segment of the lecture series on human osteology, particularly skulls and teeth. We worked on our directionals within and around the body, anatomical planes. Then we discussed the individual bones of the skull. Now let's talk about one of the most important parts of your skull, and that's your teeth. Now, of course, when we think about the reasons for your skull, right? Why have a skull? Interesting question, right? One, to hold your brain case. Two, to be a part of the area that attaches to your spinal column. Three, to be a focal point for a number of your different senses, taste, smell, sight, and then, of course, chewing. And that's what mastication is. A fancy word for chewing is just mastication. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about at least different types of teeth, and in specific reference to adult teeth. We'll learn about baby or milk or deciduous teeth as a number of different terms for them once we start talking about how we age the skeleton. And so this lecture segment will focus on the different types and categories of teeth, as well as important landmarks that are associated with chewing. In humans, there are 4 different types of teeth. And the first teeth that we'll talk about are the ones that are associated closest to the midline. Now, you also have maxillary and mandibular dentition, and they are different, but they contain the same types of teeth. Your incisor teeth are the ones that are the most anterior, right, towards the front. And since we're symmetrical, and this is along the sagittal plane, right, the maxilla, you can see in inferior view, still retains the suture line that shows that it's 2 halves. The mandible is 2 halves in ontogeny when you're growing up, when you're a child, and it will fuse together. It happens very quickly, even around before 5 years of age. Fuses together, and that line of fusion is completely obliterated and invisible, and it's gone. So we can actually divide the mouth into 4 quadrants, each maxillary and mandibular dentition into 2 halves. So effectively, each quadrant of the mouth is the same in terms of the configuration and the types of teeth. Although the teeth may look slightly different, with slight variation between maxillary and mandibular, they're effectively the same categories or types of teeth. I hope that makes sense. We'll go through each one of these very slowly. Incisor teeth, yes, they are the most anterior. You can see them readily when people smile. And you have 4 incisors in your maxilla as well as your mandible, 2 in each quadrant. The importance of your incisors are for shearing and cutting, right? They are typically very sharp teeth, and they will come to an edge like a peak, like a summit on a mountain. And the 2 sides will form at that peak. And when we talk about teeth, we usually talk about cusps, C-U-S-P-S, or cusp, singular. A cusp is just a ridge on a tooth. And so the incisors are plainly show you that they are only 1 cusp or 1 ridge, and that distinguishes them. Your central incisor on your maxilla is very large, and your lateral incisor is much smaller. On your maxillary dentition, the incisors, both central and lateral, they're effectively similar in size, and sometimes they're indistinguishable when they're solitary teeth. You have 1 canine per quadrant of your mouth, both on your maxillary and mandibular dentition. Matter of fact, every single mammal has only 1 canine in each one of their quadrants. There's no other organism that has multiple canines in each quadrant. Now, there are some organisms like sharks and reptiles, as well as some other mammals like some sea lions that have evolved all canine teeth. And that's a separate, this is an exception. And you can see that the canine tooth is similar to the incisor in that it does have one cusp or ridge, but the canine tooth comes more to a point, whereas the incisor forms a longer ridge line. So if we think about it, we're going through a quadrant. You have two incisors and one canine. As you see it, the incisors and canines, they are singular cusps, and they serve a similar function in that they're made for tearing and shearing. And this is typically what you do with most foodstuffs, is you start with your singular cusp teeth. You could think of biting an apple. You do not send it to the side of your face first because there's not a lot of room and surface area for you to grasp something off that apple. And you typically do it in the front of your mouth or interior so that you can use your sharpest teeth to grab a piece of that flesh off. And once you do that, then you start moving your food stuff to the post-canine or back teeth, right? Right behind the canine teeth. And the first one it usually hits is what's known as a premolar. Now, premolar is also known as a bicuspid if you talk to dentists or dental assistants and people that work in dental hygiene. Bi meaning two, cusp meaning ridge. And so it does. It has two cusps, one that looks like a canine that's closer to your cheek, and then one that looks like a molar cusp or ridge, which is nice and round, that's closer to your tongue. In humans, we have two of them. We're going to learn about some other creatures that have three. That's a difference we see in other primates. But you have two premolars, so do all the apes that have ever lived, as well as all the old world monkeys that are indigenous to parts of Africa and Asia. So, you know, this two premolar configuration is unique among a number of different primates. And your tooth row in this way is indistinguishable from old world monkeys as well as apes. New world monkeys actually have three, and that's one way to tell the difference if you're just looking at the teeth. So incisors and canines, one cusp. Premolars have two. And if we're building the quadrant here, you have two incisors, one canine, and two premolars. This brings us to the most posterior teeth you have, which are molar teeth. We've already gone through incisors, canines, premolars, and now to the molar teeth. And most people have DNA that will make three of them. Now, some of you actually only have two, like me. That's because in many Western cultures, because we eat much softer foodstuffs and don't really have room for the third or the wisdom tooth to erupt and emerge properly, they get removed. And so some people have two, but oftentimes DNA calls for three. Molar teeth oftentimes have 3, 4, 5, or even more cusps. So when you look at the mouth and how it's made to be used for chewing, you start off with the sharpest teeth for shearing and tearing, and then you slowly move food to the back or post-canine teeth where they're crushed and ground, because molar teeth aren't really sharp. They are very round, bulbous cusps with steep basins that allow juices and other pulp to move down into your mouth. When you chew, your palate or your maxilla is actually curved and it's round, and so you chew your food up and you move it into the middle cavity or the oral cavity, and then it forms what's known as a bolus, a nice little round area, and then that's when you swallow it. Now let's put all the teeth together and talk about the dental formula. Remember that this area of the body falls along the sagittal suture along the midline, so it's symmetric. that would mean that effectively, in theory, each one of the quadrants of your mouth is identical in terms of category and number of teeth. And so when you look at the dental formula, and you can see this number off to the right in black and bold, it says 2, 1, 2, 3, and it kind of looks like a numerator and a denominator. The one on the top, the numerator, actually represents the maxillary dentition, and then the denominator, or the bottom, looks like it's representing the mandibular teeth. So when you look at each one of our quadrants of the mouth, you have 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, and 3 molars. And this dental formula, as I had mentioned before, is indistinguishable from Old World monkeys and apes. Now, New World monkeys, their dental formula is 2, 1, 3, 3. And that's one way to tell the difference between other groups of primates. This brings us to the muscles of mastication. You not only have the hardware to break up foods, but we also have to talk about the muscles that are part of this whole system that allows you to break it down and provides you with the force and the power to do so. And the muscles of mastication are important because, as again, we've discussed how males and females have different components of musculature, in that males typically have larger muscles, more robust, and ones that are more powerful in that, for that matter. The 3 muscles of mastication typically include the temporalis, masseter, and the medial pterygoid. And each one of these muscles actually affect bone. Because the larger the muscle, the larger the anchor on the bone that is required for it to actually be functional. I've provided here a number of different landmarks for the muscles that were just previously described. As I mentioned before, any area on bone that contains muscles that are kind of pulling in a particular direction will need some type of bony anchor so that it actually can be functional. So if we look at the temporalis as well as the masseter muscle, the pterygoid muscle is inferior in the area of the mandible, and I believe and connects to the sphenoid. And that one is not something that we're really going to emphasize, because it doesn't necessarily, since it's not as large, it doesn't leave signature marks on the mandible that we can use to identify human skeletal remains. So if you look at the areas for the temporalis, the coronoid process, which is just anterior of the mandibular condyle, right? The mandibular condyle, remember, articulates with the temporal fossa, and the coronoid process that is just in front of it, or anterior, as mentioned, is the area of insertion of the temporalis muscle. The temporalis muscle then travels underneath the temporozygomatic arch and is splayed along the frontal, right, and distributed along the frontal as well as the parietal bones. You see this nice, long, circular, rotund line that goes along the lateral portion here, the left lateral portion of the frontal and the left parietal. Males typically have larger temporalis muscle lines. This may be a good indicator if that's all you had to go on. If you saw one that was really robust and it was just a piece of bone, that's all you had, and they said, well, is it male or female? You might go, well, we know that males have larger musculature. This is a very prominent temporal line, probably the most prominent one I've ever seen. It could be, or most likely, is that of a male. You can feel your temporalis muscles when you're chewing, and you can even do it right now. You can take your hand and put it up to the side of your head, lateral portion by the frontal parietal, and move your mouth up and down, right? Have your teeth, maxillary, mandibular dentition, have contact with each other and put some pressure. You can feel the temporalis muscle contracting. Now, the other muscle that's important for sexual dimorphism is the masseter muscle. The masseter inserts on this area known as the gonial region, and that is the most lateral portion of the mandible. And then the origin of the masseter muscle is on the zygomatic arch. Sometimes we'll see in males that are robust and have large musculature, they will have a more robust zygomatic and zygomatic arch for that matter. We will also notice what's known as gonial flare on the mandible. So males, when you look at them head on, typically will have a square chin and a mandible that kind of juts out laterally, which is known again as gonial flare. These are indicators that the individual has large musculature, and oftentimes it's most prominent in males. That concludes the series on human osteology, skulls and teeth, right? We talked about how we could divide the skeleton or human skeletal anatomy into two major parts, the skull and the postcrania, everything else but the skull. So the next lecture series after this will focus on the postcranial skeleton. Now, after you've worked on the material from the lecture, begin working on the lab for this segment, and then as well as the quiz.